Hello, I'm Professor Tracy Cooper from Tyler School of Art and Architecture at Temple University, and I'm a board member of Save Venice and also a member of the Projects Committee and Educational Resources Committee, two active committees on Save Venice. And I would like to thank you for joining us today. We have a wonderful presentation for you. And a special thank you to our Save Venice members. As members, your contributions help us to preserve the artistic heritage of Venice, which includes the work of women artists like Rosalba Carriera. We are excited to recently have launched Women Artists of Venice, a new program for which I will be heading the research track, and our Venice director, Melissa Kahn, the conservation track. Later, I'll share more information about how to become involved with this exciting new venture. I would like now to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Xavier F. Salomon. Dr. Salomon is Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. He is a noted scholar of Paolo Veronese and curated the monographic exhibition on the artist at the National Gallery in London. This was in March of 2014. Previously, he was curator in the Department of European Paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Arturo and Holly Malozzi Chief Curator at the Dulwich Picture Gallery. He has curated Veronese and Murano, two Venetian Renaissance masterpieces restored in 2017 and 18. It seems so recent. And Murillo, the self-portraits in the same years, as well as Canova's George Washington in 2018. He's working, among many other projects, on a catalog raisonné of Veronese drawings, very important. Xavier serves as a member of the Projects Committee and on the Board of Directors of Save Venice. And you may also know Xavier as someone who helped us all during the pandemic with his celebrated series, Cocktails with a Curator. Let me also remind you, if during the lecture you have questions, please add those to the Q&A, and Xavier will be happy to take those up once he's finished his talk. And in addition, I would like to welcome you again and invite you to enjoy this wonderful lecture. Xavier?
Thank you so much, Tracy. Wonderful to see you all this sunny morning here in New York. Thank you again for the introduction. And I'm very excited to talk about today's subject for a number of reasons, because clearly it links my research at the Frick Collection right now with a big component of what Save Venice is doing with the Women Artists Project that Tracy and Melissa are spearheading. So I'm going to start with sharing my slides. Tracy, I hope everyone can see them. I'm assuming
looks beautiful.
Thank you. So this is very much work in progress, and I should start by saying this because what I am presenting today is part of an ongoing research which is going to take still some time to be completed and hopefully turned into an article, maybe something more than that. As you can imagine, this is research that has happened over the last year and a half, and with the pandemic and everything else, it's been somewhat difficult to do as much as I was hoping to do. But nonetheless, I am quite proud of how much I managed to achieve in the middle of a world pandemic. The research started from these two extraordinary pastels by Rosalba. Rosalba Carriera is arguably the most important woman artist of 18th century Europe. So important and so celebrated that she was known by her first name, she was La Rosalba, Rosalba, like Michelangelo, like Raphael, like Titian. And this fame, as we will see, was an international one. Her works are incredibly fragile by nature. They're pastels, very difficult to transport, very dangerous to transport. So she's not an artist who is hugely well known because a lot of her work is in a few museums, mostly in Europe, and we'll talk about that in a second. So for us at the Frick, it was incredibly important and wonderful and lucky that about a year ago in 2020, we were given these two extraordinary pastels by her from the collection of Alexis Gregory. And some of you following this program, I know, may have known Alexis. He was a great figure in the social world in New York City, in the arts world. He was the founder of Vendôme Press, the publishing house, but a great expert and lover of music and art. And 28 objects from his collection have come to the Frick after his death in 2020. And we will be doing an exhibition about this group of objects at some point in 2022 or 23 here at Frick Madison, a temporary home at the Frick. So the two pastels appear to be pendants, but probably are not. They are a woman and a man. They're framed in similar ways, but they're later frames. I'm convinced more and more that they're actually separate things that happen to be joined together at some later stage. We actually, unfortunately, do not know much about their history, but in many ways, they're the quintessential beautiful Rosalba images that everyone knew in the 18th century and loved. Here is this clearly aristocratic lady, well-dressed with this incredible jewelry, the pearl earrings, the diamonds, finishes of her dress and on her shoulder, the flowers in her décolleté, and this sort of voluminous blue mantle, and this sort of wonderful air of elegance and sophistication which Rosalba gives to all of her sitters. The man, in many ways, is the most extraordinary of the two, and we'll go back talking about his costume, but he is wearing a very peculiar, very interesting costume, which has led to a number of theories as to what it may mean. We don't know who these two people are, and it remains to be determined. Many pastels by Rosalba, unfortunately, are of anonymous sitters, and that is because often in the inventories they appear as a man or a woman by Rosalba, and unless we have inscriptions or documents, it's very difficult to find out who they are. The pastels are hanging right now at Frick Madison. Pastels are very light sensitive, so these will not be on view on a regular basis, but they will be for at least the next year. And so if you're in New York City or you're coming to New York City, you can see them in a little alcove we created at Frick Madison with some Venetian pictures. And here you see one of the two Rosalbas with Guardi and Tiepolo. Now, let's talk a little bit about Rosalba herself. This is where it all happened. This building that you see here across the Canal Grande, next to the Guggenheim Museum, the Peggy Guggenheim on the left, is the house where Rosalba lived and worked for most of her life, for more than 50 years. It is a house that was rented. Interestingly enough, most artists in Venice in the 18th century, but even before, would rent the spaces they lived in rather than buy them, as wealthy as they were. And Rosalba was incredibly wealthy. When Rosalba dies, her fortune is about 10 times the fortune of Canaletto. So this gives you a real sense of what a great artist she was and what a great businesswoman she was. The house is rented by her parents to begin with, and she lives there with her parents, and then she takes over the house later on after her parents' death, and she will die eventually in this house. There is an inscription which was added in 1962, pointing out that this is the house where Rosalba lived from the 1st of November 1700, at least that's when she's first documented in this house at San Vio, until her death in April 1757. The house itself is a fairly simple house, but we have to imagine that this is where she lived with her family, with her parents to begin with, her sisters, and this is also where she worked. And we have many records of travelers, visitors coming to Venice and going to Rosalba's house and being portrayed by her. So most of the pastels we will be seeing today, and I imagine even the ones at the Frick, were most likely created in this house. And this is the view from Rosalba's house across the canal. I was lucky enough to examine most of the house. I've been in every apartment in the house, and it's been transformed quite a bit. There isn't really anything surviving from Rosalba's time, except from the basic shape of the rooms. But I was really stunned when I went into the house by the light in the house, which of course is the light coming straight in from across the canal, but also reflected from the canal through the window. This is the, let's call it piano nobile, the first floor European style, second floor American style, which is really where her working spaces were, as far as we know, and where she spent most of her time. She's actually looking across the canal. Where the white building is across the canal is actually where we now know Carpaccio's workshop and house was in the 15th and 16th century. So there are these interesting links, obviously, always with Venice. And, you know, if Rosalba knew that Carpaccio had lived across the street, across the canal, I don't really know. But it's always wonderful to sort of think about these interesting connections. Now, Rosalba herself is the daughter of a lawyer and a lace maker, a very famous lace maker. Her grandfather was a painter. He was a terrible painter, as far as we know, a local painter from Chioggia, not very talented. How Rosalba trains to be an artist is still very unclear. There have been many suggestions, but what is clear is that she begins very early on to work in a series of media in Venice that are not very popular at the time, and also not covered, let's say, by male artists. She's not painting in oils. She's not drawing per se. I mean, she is drawing as part of a working method, but not producing independent drawings. She works as a miniaturist and then as a pastelist. Here you see her in an early self-portrait, very much as an elegant lady, along the lines of the portrait she makes herself, in the act of creating a pastel that she's holding in her hand. And it's been argued that the pastel may be a portrait of her sister, Giovanna. There is clearly a family resemblance, and we know that Giovanna worked with Rosalba all of her life. Now, Rosalba's father must have been a fairly enlightened man. He leaves all of the business of his activities as a lawyer and as a civil servant to Rosalba, to his daughter, and she is managing the household over a long period of time while her father is away or not in Venice. And after the father's death, she really becomes the key person in the household. There are three sisters. Confusingly enough, in 1673, Rosalba is born and baptized Rosalba Giovanna, and 2 years later, in 1675, a second sister is born, also called Rosalba Giovanna, which has created a lot of confusion about the birth date of Rosalba. What is clear is that the first daughter is known as Rosalba, the second as Giovanna. It's been argued that the reason the second sister had the same name as the first was that Rosalba was so sickly as a young girl that the parents thought she wasn't going to make it through, and they just already renamed the second daughter with the same name. I don't know, this may be a little romantic and a little without foundation, but that's one of the theories put forward. She becomes a very successful artist very early on, from the early 1700s. As a young woman, she's already running her own workshop and working in the house at San Vio. Here you see her later on in a very, very beautiful self-portrait as this elegant, powerful woman. This is in the Royal Collection in the UK, and a really scathing caricature from the Cini Foundation of Rosalba by Anton Maria Zanetti, who was actually one of Rosalba's best friends. So this, as cruel as this caricature is, it's done with the best intentions from a friend who was a rather scathing caricaturist in general. And the inscription says that this is Mrs. Rosalba, the friend of the author. And in a way, he is playing with this idea of the pastel format, with the jewelry around her neck, with the headdress, in this tiny caricature. Now, Rosalba begins as a miniature painter. And she becomes famous in the early 1700s until the early 1720s, really, primarily as a miniaturist. This is the little miniature of a girl holding a dove, which gets her, as a very young woman, into the Accademia di San Luca in Rome. Rosalba joins 3 academies: the Accademia di San Luca, the Accademia Clementina in Bologna, and the Académie Royale in Paris. This, you know, again, for a woman, for a single woman, an artist at the time, is extraordinary. These academies were not closed to women. They were open to women, and there were other women academicians at the time in Rome, in Bologna, and in Paris, but it was still clearly a majority male-led academy. Rosalba was beloved, and I suspect that part of the reason for this was that she was working in a media that artists at the time did not feel, male artists did not feel threatened by. As I say, not many artists pretty much in the early 1700s were producing miniatures in Venice, if at all in Italy. Miniature is always seen as a more northern French, English tradition. And clearly Rosalba is very clever in cornering this market very early on and producing these very, very beautiful objects. Now, most of them are allegorical to some extent, but they're really beautiful images of young girls with pets, with fruits, dressed up as peasants. And these were small objects that people would collect, mostly for a male audience. It's worth remembering that most of Rosalba's audience and clients are men. There are very interesting letters. There is a letter from a patron asking Rosalba to paint a miniature of a woman. And he says, I would like the woman to be as naked as possible, as far as you are comfortable with that. So clearly some of these images are also somewhat titillating for men, and there is an erotic overtone to many of these small miniatures. These are portable small objects, and I'd like to remind you of that by showing you this. Miniatures were worn often by people around their neck. They were kept in pockets. People traveled with them, and there were often gifts of sort of love exchanges. Here are 2 miniatures. These are clearly portraits of men, and clear exactly who they are. There are various theories about both of them. The one on the left at Carezzonico in Venice, the one on the right at Chantilly in France. And I examined all of these very recently. These are painted usually on ivory or bone, sometimes less often on paper of some kind. But as you can see, they often, always, invariably rest in your hand and are portable objects, most often with still their original frames in tortoiseshell or sometimes even gold or gilt bronze. But with time, Rosalba moves on to the format of pastels. And this is really to do with the fact that she's having problems with her eyes very early on. And clearly the painting in miniatures strains the eyes to such a level that she decides to move on a larger format that's easier for her. There are requests for miniatures all the way in the 1720s and 30s, and she often writes back saying, I can't paint miniatures anymore. My eyes don't allow me to do that. So she focuses on the portraits. These, of course, are the Frick ones. But I want to show what these objects are actually like as physical objects, which will be important to what I will discuss in a minute. Here you see 2 formats, and this is to explain that also Rosalba worked on very standard formats. There was a sort of small, medium, large. They're all more or less the same. She would buy these objects pre-prepared before painting on them. And I'm using the word painting, the verb painting, because in the 18th century, pastel is considered painting, is not drawing. You know, there's always a big debate now with museums as to where pastels sit, if they're in the drawings department, the paintings department. If you were in the 18th century, they would have firmly been in the paintings department. So they're painted on paper, blue paper, and the example on the right shows you a very well-preserved type of blue paper, which over time discolors a bit, and what you see on the left on the edges is a discolored greenish blue paper. But the blue paper in the smaller ones is on occasion stretched on a strainer by itself, just a paper. Most likely, most often it is with a secondary support of canvas. So you have to imagine the paper stretched over the canvas, stretched around the strainer. And that's what you see on the left. This is the back of a typical Rosalba pastel, where you see both the canvas and the paper and the wooden strainer. And she would actually paint on the already strained pastel. It's actually impossible to paint it on a sheet of paper and then stretch it afterwards. The type of pastel she produced varied quite greatly. I mean, they're all figurative in the sense that they usually represent a single figure, occasionally a double one. Some are straightforward portraits. What you see on the right is a portrait of the singer Faustina Bordon, a very famous soprano, Italian soprano that moves to the court of Dresden, to Saxony. And there you see her in a fairly straightforward portrait as a famous singer. This is a Carazzonico in Venice. But on the left, you see her again at a younger date as an allegory of music. She has a sheet of music and she's singing. And so sometimes the portraits are a combination of allegory and portrait. This, for example, is probably the most famous Rosalba pastel in the United States. It was acquired in the 1980s by the Art Institute in Chicago, The Lady with the Parrot. And there are, of course, a lot of discussions about, is this a portrait? It's said to be an English lady. I cannot frankly imagine an English lady showing her chest so prominently in a portrait. I think this, maybe an actress, maybe a somewhat more fantastic figure. We don't know what the purpose of this picture is. I see it definitely more in a sort of theatrical world of acting and music, the idea of this woman being the mistress of someone who commissions this sort of, slightly titillating portrait rather than a just straightforward official portrait. But she also paints allegorical figures. These are two very, very beautiful religious figures. It's somewhat unclear what they actually represent. They're part of a set of 4. And they're in a private collection in the United States, and they're on view right now in an exhibition in Hartford about women artists. Where to see Rosalba? As I mentioned at the beginning, there are really 2 cities where you see Rosalba in quantity. One is Dresden, Germany. One is Venice. Here is a wall of Rosalba pastels at the Gemälde Gallery in Dresden. The Elector of Saxony, Augustus III, also King of Poland, was one of the greatest collectors of Rosalba. He buys a huge amount of Rosalbas from various collectors, from Rosalba herself, and assembles a collection of more than 100 Rosalbas. There are now about 75 still in Dresden, and this is a selection of them. But of course, the second place is Venice. And in Venice, there are about 20 18, 19 portraits by Rosalba with some works from the workshop. This is a display currently at the Accademia in Venice. They have about 9, and Carazzonico, we'll talk more about that at the end of this talk. They also have 9. This slide is slightly cheating. What you see on the sides are actually 4 pastels by Marianna Carlevaris, who probably worked also with Rosalba, and the Rosalba's in the middle, but there are, again, about 9 Rosalbas altogether at Carazzonico. So between Venice and Dresden, you have the large groups, but then, of course, there are groups in Florence, in Venice, in France, in the United States. Rosalba is an international artist. She travels extensively, and it's worth pointing this out because she is someone who lives and works most of her life in Venice, in the house in San Vio, but there are periods that she spends abroad. She spoke fluent French and fluent English, as far as we know, and she writes a lot of her correspondence in French. There aren't any letters in English, but she supposedly spoke very good English with her patrons and her correspondence, and she had a very international correspondence with a number of people in the art world. Unlike any other painter in 18th century Italy, if not Europe, we have an incredible trove of documents for Rosalba. There are about 500 letters from her, by her, to her that survive, and they are all conserved for a number of reasons in Florence. And we have diaries of some of her trips as well, which are very moving and very interesting to read, especially of her trip to France. And she travels to France in 1720, 21, and works at the court of Louis XV. This is a portrait of the young king, who was a kid at that time. And the descriptions of the court in France are very wonderful. And we know that she travels with her mother and her sister, and she goes to the opera, to the ballet. She meets all of the aristocracy at the time. She meets many of the artists. She becomes very good friends, for example, with Watteau, the painter who only dies slightly later that year in 1721. But she then also travels A few years later in 1723 to Modena, to the Este court, and these are two of the Este princesses that she portrays at the time. There's a whole series of portraits of the daughters of the Duke of Modena. These also are divided between Dresden and Uffizi in Florence. And in 1731, she travels to Vienna to the imperial court, and she works for the mother of the emperor, who you see in this beautiful pastel in Dresden. Apart from these three trips, Paris, Modena, and Vienna, she spends the rest of her life firmly in Venice. The pastels are extraordinary, and here I'm showing you some photographs that I've taken of some unframed pastels in the last year and a half. And this is just to show you the virtuosity of these objects, how beautiful they are. So here are two different pastels, the wigs of the men, how they're painted. And pastel, of course, is a pure pigment mixed with different types of binders. And the recipes exactly for these sort of pastels in the 18th century are very uneven. There are many ways of doing it, and we don't know exactly what Rosalba was using to mix these pastels, but it's clear that she produced them herself. She also bought them from a number of places, and there are letters about how she preferred certain pastels rather than others. And maybe not surprisingly for the technique at the time, her favorite pastels are the French one from Paris. She's getting them from Rome, she's getting them from a number of other cities, but she keeps insisting that the ones from Paris are the best that she uses. The pastels are very wet in the way she uses them. So this is a technique that is almost similar at some point to gouache. Pastels tend to be very powdery and very fragile. Rosalba pastels are actually very resistant as far as they can be because of the technique she uses. She's an incredible master at painting fabrics and textiles. And here, you know, the transparency of this veil on the left with the blue embroidery over a fur a surface textile, the embroidery on the right, and the lace from Burano probably, which is something that her mother was making. This is the details of an incredible pastels of Bonnie Prince Charlie, the young pretender of the Stuart court who travels to Venice, his Order of the Garter, and his incredibly beautifully designed outfit. But again, the jewelry, the diamonds, the pearls, the flowers, this again is a detail of the Chicago pastel where you have the pearls and this beautiful ribbon, and again, the lace around it. It's an incredible tour de force. Now, in terms of outfits, I mentioned that our pastel of the man is a very curious one because he is wearing this outfit that identifies him as a pilgrim. And there are a number of reasons, I'm not going to go into that now, but there are a number of reasons why that may be the case. The most likely reason, however, is that this is a carnival costume from Venice. This is clearly a visitor to Venice who is portrayed in this costume with his tricorn hat slightly askew, which is something that you would do as an informal portrait rather than a formal one. The one I'm showing you on the right in black and white is the other known pastel by Rosalba of another man with a pilgrim outfit. This was last seen in the 1970s in Paris. If anyone knows where it is, please let me know. I've been trying to find it for a long time. But you clearly see that the man is also wearing this black sort of cape on top of his shoulders, which identifies him as a pilgrim. And he has the pilgrim staff, this sort of stick that both men are holding, which clearly identifies them as pilgrims. So I'm focusing on this because the pastel at the Frick of the man was the starting point for the research that I've been carrying out in the last year and a half. And the title of this talk is about Rosalba and the Three Kings. So what have the Three Kings got to do with this? Now, this is the back of our pastel at the Frick. When you look at it, it looks fairly straightforward. The canvas, the paper, the strainer. But as we were examining it after it came to the Frick at the end of 2020, we realized that there was a little piece of paper hidden behind the strainer. And we took the piece of paper out, it was folded, and opened it up. And what we realized is that it was a sacred image with a text. The medallion shows the Virgin Mary and the Christ child surrounded by the three magi, with the star of Bethlehem that brings the Magi to the birthplace of Jesus. and below it, a view of the German city of Cologne. The inscription on the right is partly in Latin, partly in Italian. And the Latin part says that this is the same three kings, Gaspar, Melchior, and Baldassar, which are the traditional names of the kings. Pray for us now and in the hour of our death. And then underneath it in Italian, it says that the Holy Magi from Cologne, in Cologne, for the grace of God, would preserve the travelers from the bad hours of travel, from headaches, from epilepsy, from fever, from witchcraft, and any sort of malefice and sudden death. And this is printed in Cologne and in Padua with permission of the superiors of the right sort of authorities. So why Cologne? And the link to Cologne is a very specific one because the relics of the Magi are preserved to this day in the Cathedral of Cologne in Germany, which you see the great Gothic building on the right. And there you see the casket below where the bones, supposedly, of the Magi are preserved. Since the Middle Ages, a tradition started, which of course the three kings are the protectors for travelers. They traveled from faraway lands to visit Christ in Bethlehem, and they were guided, of course, by the star. And the relics of the Magi were visited by pilgrims. And what would happen is that little tickets like this, little pieces of paper with the image of the kings and some prayer on it, were produced, printed, rubbed against the tomb, the relics, and people would travel with them on their bodies to preserve them. And so this is a kind of health passport. I mean, I'm not sure if it works during pandemics, but maybe it was intended to do that too. But it would preserve you against, anything bad happening on your travels, from a headache to a epileptic fit, to sudden death, to witchcraft, to fever, to all sorts of other things. And people believed that by carrying these on their bodies, it would preserve them. And what we do know from a letter is that Rosalba herself believed in this, and she was particularly devoted to the Magi of Cologne, and that she actually did put tickets of this kind into her pastels and her works of art to preserve them during their travels. And the letter is, I'm going to try and get the text of the letter itself, because it's a very interesting sort of document about what Rosalba believed. So this is a letter from a man called Pier Caterino Zeno in Venice to Anton Francesco Marmi, who is in Florence. And Zeno writes in December 1729. He talks about Carriera's distinct devotion to the three kings, who brought themselves to the adoration of the baby Jesus at the grotto of Bethlehem. Once she gave me a certain portrait to send to my brother in Vienna, and she gave me a little card of the three aforementioned adoring Magi, and said that to these she entrusted the safe outward journey of the portrait, adding that whenever such little images had accompanied her pictures, they had always arrived safely. So this little print in the Rosalba, the frick, was put there by Rosalba herself. And it means effectively, and that's what I'm trying to prove, that the Rosalbas that have these tickets hidden in them clearly traveled somewhere outside of Venice. And that's one of the things that I'm working on with this material. Now, I didn't discover the first of these tickets. We knew that there were some. These are three examples that were published in Dresden. Dresden had some in their collection, and they were actually glued to the back of the pastels. And here you see that it's effectively always the same scene. Well, the image is slightly different. The prayer is the same prayer and the different designs, but these are attached to the backing of the pastel. So this is Faustina Bordon that I showed you earlier on. And on the back, there is one of these images. Three of them have been published in the literature. And then in 2017, the first one was found behind one of the strainers. And it's this little image again of the three kings of Cologne behind the Allegory of Winter in the Royal Collection in the UK. And a second one was found at the Louvre in Paris. And this is the pastel of a follower of Apollo, which was the pastel that Rosalba submitted for her entry into the Académie Royale in the 1720s and was sent from Venice to Paris. And so she clearly put the image in behind the strainer to protect this pastel during its travels. So I started looking for them. And this is what I've been doing for the last year and a half. I have now unframed more than 50 Rosalbas by her, by members of the workshop. And I plan to do lots more of it, trying to unframe as many as possible to reach some conclusions. And there are a number of conclusions. So far I have found no evidence that she put these tickets in pastels that did not leave Venice. So first of all, we can determine that a pastel was traveling if it has the image in it. If not, it didn't. I'm trying to work out if there are similarities in terms of date between the time she used certain models, and you'll see that there are different types of these images, different designs. And there are a number of other related issues that I'm hoping the more pastels I get to analyze, the more we'll have a good sense of some of these conclusions. Now, I started close to home. The first thing I did after finding the ticket in ours is I got in touch with the Metropolitan Museum, and this is the beautiful Rosalba, again, a carnival costume that they have at the Met, and I asked them if they'd ever found anything. Their first answer was, we've analyzed it many times, there's nothing in it, but you can check if you want to. And sure enough, tucked under the strainer, you see it there in the little corner, there was a little image of the kings. And we know that this is an Irish nobleman, and the picture was sent to his home in Ireland. So this is clearly something that traveled. And there again, in this case, just a very straightforward image of the three kings. This is in a private collection in New York, the collection of a contemporary artist who has two Rosalbas, and we did find one in one of them. Here it is. And again, it's another image of Cologne with the Virgin and Child and the kings adoring the child. Over the last year and a half, I have unframed all of the Rosalbas and Rosalba workshop in Venice, in the Veneto, in public institutions, in Padua, in Treviso, in a number of private collections, on the East Coast, on the West Coast. I can now safely say that for a number of reasons, none of the Rosalba pastels on the West Coast, at the Getty, in San Diego, in San Francisco, unfortunately, none of them has a Santino. I've looked at some in France, in London, at the National Gallery. And this is something that clearly, if you have a Rosalba pastel at home, please don't check it yourself. It's a very difficult thing to do in terms of doing it safely, and it has to be done with conservators and properly done. And we've analyzed all of the pastels, especially the ones in Venice, very carefully. This is one at the Accademia in Venice. This is one of the most beautiful ones in the Accademia, Cardinal de Polignac, where you see that clearly in the right upper corner, there are some serious issues with the paper, and there are these huge cracks which are getting worse and worse. And this is something that desperately needs conservation eventually. The problem is it's also unclear how you can conserve something like this, and that's a whole other discussion. But this is a pastel, for example, where I was told that because of the condition, they had been monitoring it for a long time, and it had been studied over and over again. And clearly it had no religious image. They never found one. This is a pastel of a French cardinal, Cardinal de Polignac. And Cardinal Polignac ordered this, well, his secretary probably ordered this from Paris. So this is something that traveled. And as I examined it, sure enough, there was a Santino in this as well that no one had found before. This particularly wonderful as far as I'm concerned, because it's the only one I found so far that has the initials of the three kings, GMB, Gaspar, Melchior, and Baldassar, and the very prominent central M. And I wonder if this is Rosalba's homage also to the patron, because the cardinal is Cardinal Melchior de Polignac. So this also, the kings in this case are also a reference to the name of the sitter. So the research is very much ongoing. I still have to examine the ones in a number of museums. I'm going to go in the next few months to see the ones in Boston, and there is one at Harvard. There are some in Cleveland, in Detroit. So I still have to visit a few institutions in America. There are some private collectors I'm in touch with. The big question for me is going to be to examine the English ones, and I have an appointment already in November with a country house in England that has a number of Rosalbas that we know were sent from Venice directly to this country house and still belongs to the family. So that's going to be for me a very key moment I'm expecting to find Santini in at least all of them, hopefully, if not some. And we'll see what comes out of that. Those are pastels that we know, for example, were hardly ever touched by anyone. So, and it is very moving to find these tickets, these pieces of paper, and know that the last person who put them there was Rosalba herself. Now, to conclude, before we open the floor to questions, Rosalba's life is an incredibly successful and incredibly fruitful one in terms of her work. She is a workaholic. She clearly suffered from depression to some level. I find it very moving when you read her diaries. She talks about all the activities. She talks about all the people she portrays. And it's clear that sometimes she's, quite often actually, she's portraying people she doesn't know. People are literally turning up at her workshop in Venice or in Paris, asking to be portrayed, and she doesn't know who all of them are. So she often records in the diary that she's done the portrait of a blonde Englishman or a dark-haired Englishman. Once she says, I portrayed an Englishman with a broken leg. And there is no name and surname. She often doesn't even know who they are. And she's painting these very, very quickly, very fast, probably even more than one a day. And then she has moments of incredible depression, being overworked, and her mother and her sister often tell her she's working too hard. And so there are these wonderful entries, very touching entries, where she just says, today I was very sad, and that's it. That's the only entry for the day. Her life, unfortunately, ends up being a tragic one. And after all the incredible success of this extraordinary human being, she succumbs to health issues. First of all, most people around her disappear. She never marries. Her sister Giovanna never marries. She lives with her widowed mother and Giovanna. The mother dies, Giovanna dies, and she's left alone. The only sister that survives is the youngest sister, Angela. There were three sisters to begin with. And Angela is married to another painter, Pellegrini. And Angela also becomes a widow, and eventually it's going to be Angela who takes care of Rosalba. But from the late 1740s, Rosalba starts having trouble with her eyes. And the trouble that she already had clearly in the 20s gets worse and worse, and she suffers from severe cataracts. And she undergoes 3 different surgeries between the late 40s and the early 50s, which of course at the time must have been a pretty horrific operation. And even though the first 2 operations seem to have had some effect, clearly the situation gets worse and worse and worse. And finally, by the early 1750s, she is totally blind. And so she spends the last almost 10 years of her life in total blindness at San Vio in a house. This is probably the last self-portrait we have of her with this laurel wreath, but you somehow, and maybe I'm projecting a little bit, but you already get a sense of this artist, the melancholy of her knowing that she is losing the most important tool for her trade, for her work. And the idea of her spending these 10 years in total darkness in that house with only her sister and servants taking care of her is pretty heartbreaking. Rosalba dies in 1757 in the house in San Vio, and she is buried in the church of San Vio. And this is from the Jacopo de Barberi woodcut much earlier in the 1500s. But it shows you where the church was, not far away from the Save Venice offices in Venice. This is the site of the church today, Campo San Vio. The building you see in the middle is where the church was. It's a 19th century building. The church was destroyed in Napoleon's time. And this building was built eventually on its site with a small modern chapel to the right, which includes some of the stones and fragments originally from the parish church of San Vio. Rosalba was very pious, very close to the parish priest of San Vio. She asked to be buried in San Vio together with her mother, together with her sister, and her entire family, effectively. The bones that were in San Vio were removed when the church was destroyed. And where Rosalba is now is this desolated little island north of Torcello. This is the island of Sant'Ariano, which was the ossuary, the place outside of Venice where bones from destroyed churches were removed. And so I've actually never been there. Apparently the place is infested with rats and snakes, which doesn't make it very interesting to visit. But you can see from the photo at the bottom that a lot of inscriptions have been moved to Sant'Ariano as well. And I have been wondering, and I planned as part of my research eventually to also try and get there to see if the Rosalba family tomb inscription may still be abandoned there in this pretty much forsaken, abandoned island in the lagoon. But if we have to think of a physical place where the relics of Rosalba, not quite of the Magi, but are resting today and her family, that's where she is. On a happier note, I'm very proud, obviously, and happy to have these pastels on view at Frick Madison to represent Rosalba as one of the few, actually, women artists, unfortunately, who are represented at the Frick. It's something that we're working on, and I hope we can work on more in the future. In recent times, we've also added a pastel. We're adding a pastel by Vigée Lebrun to the collection as well. And there are many women artists from the 18th and 19th century who deserve to be better represented and better known. But as I said, this is very much the beginning of a journey with Rosalba, in the footsteps of Rosalba. And I'm hoping eventually to be able to share more of this research with all of you as I myself learn more about this wonderful, extraordinary artist and her work. So I will pass it back to Tracy, and we should open up for questions if anyone from the audience has any questions.
Wonderful, Xavier. Thank you so much. And thank you for the audience for some of the intriguing questions that you've offered up. Your discussion, I think, of the materiality of the object, something that is, I think, sometimes neglected and so intriguing, because many people will only see images of objects, and when they view something in a museum, often it's inaccessible to really handle the work. And I think your discussion of actually the physical nature, the backs of the objects, the fact that you found these Santini has been really enlightening. So one of the first questions is a very broad, but I think you've opened Pandora's box here. Do we know why she chose pastels and not oil paint?
So, well, we don't know for a fact. I suspect it was a business choice, effectively. Pastels, like miniatures before, were not really done by anyone in Venice. So she picks on something. I mean, pastels are, supposedly invented in the 16th century as a technique. Leonardo is one of the first people who uses pastels as many things. But there are some 16th and 17th century artists who work in this medium, and there are male painters like Benedetto Luti, for example, in the 18th century, who uses pastels. But Rosalba is the first and only one in Venice who does it. So she corners the market effectively. And I think that's why she becomes so beloved by everyone and so non-threatening in a way to male artists. And I think she does it very consciously. There is evidence that she also probably painted in oil. There is a portrait that's given to her in Vienna, but I don't know, I still have doubts about it. And clearly she knew how to paint with oil, but I don't think it's something she did, frankly, very often. So she really decides to focus on that in the same way that Canaletto decides to focus on view painting. And, it's the idea of how do you share that sort of market. Canaletto is not someone who's painting altarpieces or portraits. He focuses on the views of Venice. So she clearly, as someone who's very well connected with the international market and the tourism that's coming to Venice, and let's not underestimate that, because between German, English, French, and other nationalities, there were many, many people coming to Venice every year. And clearly she's working quite a lot for that sort of audience, as well as for a more local one.
I think you have identified something that sounds like she inherited her father's legal business. Clearly, she had the mind for managing a large workshop and having apprentices and so forth. So her attention to the market makes a lot of sense, I think, and also her command of multiple languages.
I mean, she's clearly a businesswoman
And
as well as a great artist, and that's, you know, a pretty wonderful and extraordinary thing for the time. And I think if you compare her life and her sister's lives with that of the other sister, Angela, who, you know, we have a lot of letters from, and she's clearly a male artist's wife. So she's very much about what her husband is doing, following her husband and traveling with her husband. But clearly she's a woman who is entirely dependent on her husband. Rosalba maintains that independence throughout her life, and she can do that financially, and she has to do that financially by being a businesswoman and being independent herself.
yes, I think that's an aspect of being an artist that is often underappreciated and more extraordinary when it is a woman. So a couple of other questions in relationship to the materials. Do you put a first layer down when you start to paint a pastel, as one does, or does the blue paper serve as that kind of medium base of the image?
It's a very good question. The answer is yes and no. I think she was doing both. In some cases, I mean, if you look at the area around the face, for example, of the woman on the left, you see some of that blue showing through. Some of that is the paper showing through. So there is no preparation. Some of it is actually painted on top, and there is clearly preparation under the figure in various areas. So the problem with pastels is that you cannot do paint samples as you would do on an oil on canvas. So the layering scientifically is very difficult to prove. You have to base it on observation. My observation so far, having seen about 50 unframed, is that yes, she's using some kind of layer below it most of the time. But there are areas where she's using also the paper to show through. So it's a combination in a way.
And another viewer has a question about the blue pigment and whether we know what blue pigment she used.
We assume it's lapis based. I mean, this very intense blue, it's clearly, you know, based on lapis lazuli. So I would assume it's ground lapis in, you know, the sort of pastel format, but it's an expensive blue. And she uses blue quite substantially in her pastels. The one color you don't find very often, which curiously enough, in terms of technique, and don't ask me exactly why, because it's quite a complicated thing, but it's a color that wasn't really produced in pastels until the 19th century, is green. There's very little green. And so the reds, the pinks, the purples, the blacks, the blues are very common, the whites, but very little green. And whenever you have green, it's usually a combination of yellow and blue to make the green, but it's not very stable. And the black is also another pastel that is actually very difficult to make. And the quality of the black that she's using is extraordinary. It's really, really wonderful, the blacks that she uses and the variety of blacks.
That's fascinating. There is a interest also in the Santinis, and whether or not you have ever seen or heard of any of these appearing on the backs of other artworks from the 18th century from other artists.
So the answer is no. As far as we know, no one else was doing this. And I've been curious because I've also been examining pastels by Marianna Carlevaris and by a number of other followers of Rosalba, or pastelists working around that time, just to see if they were doing it as well. And so far, it's only Rosalba who does it, as far as I can tell. There's a study that has been happening along my study, and I think they're further ahead with it, and I think it's coming out soon. Richard Spear and Letizia Treves at the National Gallery have been working a lot on Carlo Dolci, the Florentine 17th century painter. And Dolci, apparently, they discovered, I didn't know this until I spoke to them, would write prayers on the back of the stretchers of his paintings to protect them. And that's something that is a fairly recent discovery. I mean, of course, a lot of Dolci paintings have been, restored, and the stretches are not the original ones anymore, but they're publishing something about this discovery. So artists clearly thought about these ways of, protecting their works through religion. But as far as I know, the Santini one, so far, it's only Rosalba.
Yes, the thing that came into my mind was that it's not only protecting the work, but somehow there's a relationship to the image of the person, just as a kind of protective amulet in some ways. Were these just produced commercially for travelers?
I mean, I'm assuming anyone could buy them, but presumably people would buy them to protect themselves during travel. So it's a sort of talisman, it's a sort of amulet, whatever you want to call it, that you travel with. What I have not been able to prove or understand really is why there was such a thriving production of these in Padua. So we know that they're German in origins and they're in Cologne. Rosalba never goes to Cologne. The ones that we know of her that have a site of printing, they're all printed in Padua. Why is there this link between Cologne and Padua? And that's something else that I'm trying to find out more about. Rosalba portrays the Bishop of Cologne twice. So she knows the Bishop of Cologne, who's a Wittelsbach from Munich. That could be a link of how she gets to know about this, because, clearly she never goes to the Shrine of the Magi, and, how this develops, it's somewhat unclear.
And so we presume that they were printed, since they seem to vary so much, in Padua and Cologne?
Yeah. And these are woodcuts. All the ones I found seem to be woodcuts. They're very popular, very cheap prints, which in themselves, they're also quite interesting. I've discussed this with a number of print experts, and they're all quite fascinated by it, because not a lot of this material survives. These are not expensive prints that people will collect. So far, all the examples I found in Rosalba, I've never been able to find anywhere else in print sources or museums that have them. So there seem to be individual examples. They would usually come in sheets with the same print printed a number of times, and then you would cut them with scissors. And you can see that because the ones that Rosalba is using are very roughly cut. So she clearly has sheets of these, and she cuts them and then folds them and puts them into the strainer. Some of the image text ones, she often uses only the image or only the text. And I'm wondering, she's running out of the papers, and, she only has one left, and she uses it for two different pastels. And what I've been hoping to do is finding an image and a text that match in two different pastels. But so far, I haven't been able to do that. So I've only found single images and single text, but never that match. But I'm hoping at some point to find that.
Interesting. So really quite a distinctive Rosalba kind of message to her own art and to its safe passage. The comment from someone you'll find familiar here, our president, thanks you, as do many of our viewers, for your wonderful, stimulating talk, and comments on the superb quality of these pastels, and would like to know if we could hear a little bit more about other kinds of works that the Frick has received from Mr. Gregory.
So Mr. Gregory had a very extensive collection in a number of fields. Most of his bronze Renaissance sculptures, small bronzes, were given at different points to the Harvard Museums and to the MFA in Boston. Most of his paintings are going to go to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. I think there's a couple of things going to the Metropolitan Museum. I mean, pretty much the entirety of the collection is going to museums, which is incredibly generous. He had no children himself. His brother, Peter Gregory, is the executor of the will, and he's been incredibly helpful to work with over this bequest. There are single gifts. He has a very important Napoleonic bed that originally came from Fontainebleau, and that's going back to Fontainebleau. To us at the Frick, he left the pastels and a group of mostly decorative arts. So some clocks, Limoges enamels, which is the core group, a Venetian enamel, one bronze statue, some ivory, some various sort of Kunstkammer type objects. So it's mostly decorative arts. The two Rosalbas are the exception. I joke that after having done this research, I feel a little guilty, because at the beginning when we were discussing the bequest, I asked about the Rosalbas, and he had three. There was also an allegorical figure, and I didn't want to be too greedy, and I said, I'd love the portraits, but maybe the allegory can go to another museum. So the allegory is actually going to the Israel Museum, and now I slightly regret that we could have had three Rosalbas at the Frick, but one is going to Jerusalem, and I think they deserve a Rosalba as well. And that I did examine, and does not have a Santino. It's an allegory of summer.
And what size was it? Because another interest expressed by some of our viewers is has to do with the size of the particular images. The ones at the Frick would be categorized in the large category?
In terms of the actual pastel, not the Santino.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, the Frick ones,
Yeah.
I think would be medium.
Medium.
If I can go back, I'll try and do this as quickly as I can. I think the Dresden image gives you a good sense of the sizes. You see clearly, sorry, I'm going through half the PowerPoint. Gone too far.
Sure that we mind. It's such a beautiful PowerPoint with these images.
Here we go. So here you really see small, medium, large. The central one is a large. The two side ones in the central row are clearly medium, as the allegory is above, and the Frick ones are the medium size, and the heads on the right are small. Heads without hands would be in the region of 20 zucchini. If you had a half length one, would be more like 30 zucchini. A larger one was more, depending. But the very large ones, there aren't that many, actually. So that large size that you see there in the center, there are very, very few of that size.
And is there a correlation between the subject and the size, or is it just a matter of the kind of time is money? So, as opposed to difficulty in expanding the size to that larger format?
I mean, there is in this, it would be nice to say that the bigger the portrait, the more important the patron, but I think the bigger the size, the more willing the patron is to pay money. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an important patron. The King of France's portrait, for example, is a medium format, it's not a large one. But what I would say is that most of the allegories, so what you see here on the sides are two heads of women, with a laurel crown, with, a moon as Diana. Those sort of heads, I think she just basically churned out. And they were, people would go to the workshop and also find ready-made things like that and buy them ready-made rather than ordering them. What you see at the very top is a series of allegories of the elements, air, fire, water, and earth. Those are things, like the seasons that she produced over and over again. And there are many, many sets of them. And those, I think, in small or medium size were something that you could find ready-made when you went. The portraits, the very large ones, are invariably portraits, and are invariably portraits of people who are willing to pay that sort of money. There are questions about workshop as well, and different quality of some of these things. So, for example, you see the bottom row of these pastels in Dresden, and I personally think the one in the center is much weaker than the ones on the sides. And so, how that is explained, we know that Giovanna, the sister, was also working very closely with Rosalba. And unfortunately, we don't have a single pastel that we can say absolutely certainly is by Giovanna. So I wonder, I've been wondering if some of these a little weaker pastels may be by the sister rather than by Rosalba herself.
Well, hopefully some of the conservation that will be taking place thanks to the generous support of Save Venice contributors will help us to understand better this fragile medium and the complexity of such an important workshop. Xavier, as many have said, and the director of our New York office reiterates, what an extraordinary journey you've been taking with Rosalba. And thank you for bringing Save Venice friends and supporters along with you, And we're looking forward to seeing what your further explorations of these works, particularly after England, show us. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks to everyone, and we will be looking forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Save the date for December 2nd, when we have Davide Gasparotto at the Getty speaking on Artemisia Gentileschi, and the exact information on that will be put in the chat for you. Thank you again, and have a lovely day.